There is a phrase that has been in the English language for the better part of 500 years, and almost everyone who uses it has forgotten that it is about a real place. To carry coals to Newcastle, to do something so obviously pointless it barely deserves the effort, because Newcastle already had all the coal in the world. It was a joke the whole of England was in on by the 1500s, and it was a joke built on a simple fact. If you wanted coal, anywhere in the country, it came from here. From the black seams under the hills of Northumberland and Durham, down to the staithes on the river Tyne, and out to the sea in a fleet of ships that never stopped moving. For 700 years, this was the city that kept the fires of a nation, and then an empire, and then half the world, burning. It dug the coal that warmed London. It built the ships that carried it. It bred the engineers who invented the railway, the steam turbine, and the electric light bulb, and it sent them out to remake the planet. There was a stretch of the Tyne where the noise of the yards and the foundries and the coal drops was so constant, so total, that men said you could feel it in your chest from the far bank. This was the workshop of the world, and it knew exactly what it was worth. Stand on the Tyne today, and it is quiet. The great yards are gone. The staiths stand empty over the water. The last deep coal mine in the whole of the northeast closed in 2005, and the pit villages that fed the Tyne for centuries are some of the most deprived places in England. The city that powered the British Empire cannot, in the end, be said to have been beaten by an enemy, or a war, or a flood. It was closed, deliberately, from above, by decision. How does the city that fueled the world, that armed its navy, and lit its cities and built its ships, end up as a place the country decided it no longer needed? This is the rise and fall of Newcastle upon Tyne. To understand how Newcastle came to be switched off, you have to go back a very long way, because the coal here is not a Victorian story. It is not even really a modern one. Newcastle was a coal town when London was a scatter of church spires, a coal town under the Plantagenet kings, and the whole of its extraordinary rise, and the whole of its long fall, grows out of one accident of geography: the black rock under the ground, and the river that could carry it to the sea. There is no bombed cathedral at the heart of this story. What was lost here was something harder to photograph, a whole way of working and a whole way of being that had defined a city and a region for the best part of 1,000 years and was ended in a single generation. The rock was everywhere. The great northern coalfield lay beneath Northumberland and Durham in seam after seam, some of it so close to the surface that men had been scratching it out of the hillsides since the Middle Ages, and running through the middle of it was the Tyne, a river that reached the North Sea, and therefore reached everywhere. Put those two things together, coal and a navigable river, and you have the recipe for the first great energy economy in human history. The kings understood it early. In 1239, King Henry III granted the burgesses of Newcastle a charter to dig for coal, and with that single document, Newcastle became, by most reckonings, the first coal port anywhere in the world. 100 years later, in 1344, Edward III decreed that coal from the Durham and Gateshead side of the river had to pass through Newcastle to be shipped, and in 1530, a royal act went further still, restricting the shipment of all Tyneside coal to Newcastle's own quayside, and handing the trade to a cartel of local merchants. They were called the hostmen, and they are the first fortune in this story. The hostmen did not, for the most part, dig the coal or sail the ships. They controlled the point where the coal met the river. They were the middlemen who sat astride the trade, taking their cut of every single ton that went down to the water, and they grew immensely rich and immensely powerful doing it. Remember them, because the shape of what the hostmen did, growing wealthy not from the labor, but from control of the passage, is a shape this city would see again and again, all the way to the end. By the 17th century, the coal trade out of the Tyne was the largest single industry in England. Whole fleets of ships called colliers ran up and down the east coast in a constant procession, carrying Tyne coal south to London, where it had become the fuel the capital could not live without. Hundreds of thousands of tons a year, then millions, went down the river and out to sea. When Londoners burned coal to cook and to keep warm, they called it sea coal because it came to them by sea from the north, and by the end of the 17th century, the capital was utterly dependent on it. Break the coal supply from the Tyne, and you froze London. That was the leverage this city held over the nation, quietly, for centuries. The men who moved it became famous in their own right. The keelmen rowed the coal out to the waiting colliers in long flat-bottomed boats called keels, heaving tons of it by hand from the staiths to the ships anchored in the river, and they became a fierce, proud, and famously hard-drinking community with their own quarter of the city on Sandgate, their own charitable hospital, and their own songs. The keel row and, later, Bladen races were not written about a sleepy place. They were the anthems of a city that worked harder and louder than almost anywhere in the country, and knew it. The coal itself was carried down to the river on wooden rails long before the age of steam, in horse-drawn wagons running on what were called wagonways, timber tracks laid across the Durham and Northumberland countryside, from the pits to the staiths on the water. These wooden railways, some of them dating back to the early 1600s, were among the first railways of any kind anywhere in the world, built for one purpose, to move Tyneside coal to Tyneside ships. The staiths where that coal was tipped into the holds once lined the river for miles. Only one great survivor remains today, the vast timber structure at Dunstan, opened in 1893, and once handling more than 5 million tons of coal a year, now a scheduled monument, and one of the largest wooden structures in Europe, standing empty over the water as a monument to a trade that no longer exists. And here is what makes Newcastle different from almost every other town in this story. It did not merely dig a commodity and sell it. The pressure of the coal trade, the constant demand to move more of it, deeper, faster, further, turned this corner of England into the most inventive place on earth for the better part of a century. It began underground, with the problem of death. Deep coal mines fill with an explosive gas the miners called fire damp, and it killed them in their hundreds. Whole shifts wiped out in a single blast when a naked candle flame met a pocket of gas in the dark. In 1815, a doctor and colliery viewer on Tyneside appealed to the greatest chemist in Britain, Humphrey Davy, and within about 2 weeks, Davy had designed the miner's safety lamp that made deep mining survivable. A flame, enclosed in fine wire gauze, that could burn in an explosive atmosphere without setting it off. At almost the same moment, a local engine wright named George Stephenson, the son of an illiterate colliery fireman from Wylam-on-Tyne, designed a safety lamp of his own, and the two men and their supporters argued for years over who deserved the credit. It hardly mattered. Between them, they had made it possible to dig far deeper into the coal than anyone had ever dared. But Stephenson went much further than a lamp. He had grown up in and around the pits, taught himself to read as a young man, and worked his way up to become the engine wright at Killingworth Colliery, north of the city. There, wrestling with the endless problem of hauling coal out of the ground and across country to the river, he built a series of steam locomotives, and then, crucially, he understood something the others had missed, that the future lay not in the engine alone, but in the engine running on a smooth iron road built to carry it. From the coalfields of Tyneside, George Stephenson and his son Robert gave the world the railway, and the pattern they set, the gauge of the track, the shape of the locomotive, spread out from these Durham and Northumberland collieries to cover the entire planet. The machine that shrank the world was invented, at bottom, to move Newcastle's coal. The genius did not stop, and it grew in ambition as the century went on. Later, a man named William Armstrong, a Newcastle solicitor turned inventor, built a works at Elswick, on the western edge of the city, to manufacture the hydraulic machinery he had devised. It grew and grew, until it became one of the largest integrated engineering complexes anywhere in the world, a single sprawling empire on the Tyne that made hydraulic cranes and machinery, and then artillery, and then whole armoured warships, complete from the keel plates to the guns, sold to the navies of the globe. Armstrong armed the world from the banks of the Tyne, and made himself one of the richest men in Britain doing it, retiring to build a fairy tale mansion at Cragside in the Northumberland Hills, the first house in the world to be lit by hydroelectric power. Joseph Swan first demonstrated a working incandescent electric light bulb here in Newcastle before Edison had a commercial product, and the city became one of the very first places on Earth to have its streets and public rooms lit by electric light. And in 1884, an Irish-born engineer working on Tyneside named Charles Parsons invented the steam turbine, a machine that would eventually generate most of the world's electricity. To prove it could also drive a ship, he built a small vessel called the Turbinia, and in 1897 he sent it tearing through a great naval review at Spithead at over 30 knots, the fastest ship in the world, so fast the Navy's patrol boats could not catch it. The turbines Parsons built on the Tyne went on to power the great ocean liners, including the Mauretania, built at Wallsend in 1907, which held the Blue Riband for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic for 22 years. Coal, the railway, the warship, the turbine, the light bulb. Pause on that list, because it is almost absurd. A single river valley in the northeast of England gave the modern world an astonishing share of the machinery it still runs on, and it did so within a few decades and within a few miles of water. And all of it grew, in the end, out of the black seams under the hills and the endless, driving need to dig them out and move them to the sea. To understand what was lost, you have to see the Tyne at its height, and you have to understand that it was not one industry, but three, locked together. There was the coal, still pouring down from the pits. There were the shipyards, because a city that shipped that much coal learned to build the ships, and then built ships for everyone. Palmer's at Jarrow, Swan Hunter and Wigham Richardson at Wallsend, Armstrong's yards at Elswick and Walker, Hawthorne Leslie at Hebburn. And there was the heavy engineering, the marine engines and the turbines and the guns that armed the ships once they were built, coal to fire it, steel to shape it, and the deep water of the Tyne to launch it. It was a complete world. Walk down to the river on a working morning, and the scale of it took the breath away. The banks of the Tyne for miles were a solid wall of cranes and gantries and half-built hulls, ships the size of cathedrals standing up out of the water on both sides, so close together that the bows of one yard's vessel seemed to overhang the stern of the next. The hammering of the riveters was ceaseless and total, a sound that carried across the whole valley, tens of thousands of men swarming over the steel in the smoke and the sparks, the enormous grey shapes rising over the tight terraced streets that climbed the banks behind them. A third of the merchant ships in the world, at one point, were built on British rivers, and the Tyne and its neighbours, the Wear and the Tees, built a huge share of those. And when a great ship was finished, the whole community came down to the water to watch it launched. The yards would fall silent, the crowds packing the banks and the bridges, the ship poised on the slipway dressed with flags. Then the blocks were knocked away and the vast hull began to move, slowly at first and then faster, sliding stern first down the greased ways in a cloud of smoke from the friction, until it hit the river and threw up a wall of water and rode there, floating, alive, and the roar that went up could be heard across the city. Half the region had a father or a brother or a son who had worked on that hull, and the launch of a ship was the launch of something an entire community had made together with its own hands. There was nothing abstract about the pride of this place. You could stand on the bank and watch it slide into the water. You could read the money in the stone too. In the heart of Newcastle, in the 1830s, a builder named Richard Granger and the architect John Dobson had laid out one of the most elegant city centres in all of Britain, a sweep of curving classical streets in pale honey-coloured stone, Grey Street curving down towards the river beneath its great column, Granger Market, the Theatre Royal, an entire Georgian and early Victorian city raised on the profits of coal and trade. Newcastle did not think of itself as a grimy pit town, whatever the rest of the country imagined. It thought of itself as the proud capital of the North, a great regional metropolis with a university, an infirmary, banks and arcades and monuments, and it built accordingly. The wealth that came up out of the black seams was turned into one of the handsomest cities in the kingdom. And behind it all, feeding it, were the pit villages, scattered across Northumberland and Durham, hundreds of them, each one gathered around its colliery and its winding gear, tight, self-contained communities where every family measured its life by the shifts and the sound of the pit hooter. The men went down together in the cage before dawn and came up hours later, black from head to foot, and their wives poured the tin baths in front of the fire, and the whole rhythm of the place turned on the coal. These were communities bound together by shared danger in a way that people who never lived it can scarcely imagine, because the pit killed men, regularly, and everyone knew it. And once a year, they turned that solidarity into a festival, the great banners of the miners' lodges, hand-painted with the faces of union leaders and scenes of brotherhood, carried through the streets behind colliery brass bands, in a display of pride you could find nowhere else in England. By 1923, the Durham coalfield alone employed something like 170,000 men. The coal, the ships, the engines, and the villages that dug the fuel for all of it were not four separate industries. They were one organism, breathing together, and it had been alive in this corner of England for the better part of 1,000 years. It looked permanent. It was not. And the weakness was hidden inside the very thing that had made it, exactly as it had been for the hostman 400 years before. The whole vast machine rested on coal and on the heavy industry that coal had made possible, and a city that lives by heavy industry lives forever, at the mercy of forces far away and far larger than itself. A single commodity, a single kind of work, however dominant, is a single point of failure. As long as the world wanted coal and the world wanted British ships, Newcastle was invincible. The moment it wanted neither, everything the region had built for 1,000 years would be exposed at once, and the world was about to want neither. The first cracks showed early. After the First World War, the world began to change its fuel. Ships turned from coal to oil. Other nations sank their own pits and built their own yards, and the great customers who had once needed Tyneside no longer needed it so badly. Between 1909 and the early 1930s, the first wave of shipyard closures came, and in 1933, the most famous of them fell. Palmer's of Jarrow, the yard around which the whole town of Jarrow had been built, closed its gates, and more than 7,000 men lost their work in a single stroke. The town was left with almost nothing, and in 1936, 200 of its men marched the near 300 miles from Jarrow to London to beg the government for the right to work. The Jarrow March became one of the defining images of the age, and it was a warning, written as plainly as a warning can be written, of what happened to a place on the Tyne when the work was taken away. The war brought it all roaring back. The yards and the pits and the gunworks were flat out through the Second World War, and for a while afterwards the old certainties seemed to hold. In 1947, the coal mines were nationalised, taken into public ownership, and across the northeast there were still 188 collieries employing nearly 150,000 men. The ships still went down the ways. A boy leaving school on Tyneside in 1950 could still walk into the pit his father worked, or the yard his grandfather had worked, and expect it to be there for his own son in turn. That was the promise the whole region had been built on. It was about to be broken. If the story of Britain's forgotten places means something to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it is one of the few things that keeps a place like this from being forgotten twice. This channel brings the lost history of Britain's great towns and cities back to life, the places that built the modern world and were then quietly left behind by it. Now, back to the Tyne, and to the decision that switched it off. Because what happened to Newcastle and its coalfield in the second half of the 20th century was not a slow fading. It was, at the end, a choice. And this is where the comparison every northeasterner will reach for becomes unavoidable. Other places lost their industry to a war, or a flood, or a technology that no policy could have stopped. the coal under Northumberland and Durham did not run out. There was, and still is, a great deal of it down there. The Tyne did not silt up. The skills did not vanish. What happened was that the people who governed the country decided that the coal and the ships and the men who produced them were no longer worth the cost of keeping. It came in two long grinding waves, and it is worth taking them one at a time, because together they took everything. The shipyards went first. For a century, British yards had built more ships than anyone on earth, and the Tyne had been at the very heart of that. But through the 1960s and 70s, the industry was undercut, steadily and then catastrophically, by newer yards abroad, in Japan first, then South Korea and Germany, working with modern methods, lower wages, and, often, the backing of their own governments. British shipbuilding had been slow to modernize, hampered by old cramped riverside yards and years of poor industrial relations, and one by one, the great Tyne names closed or were swallowed into ever larger, ever weaker combinations. Palmer's had already gone in 1933. Now the rest followed. Hawthorne Leslie, the Neptune Yard, the Armstrong yards at Walker, the famous names that had launched thousands of ships, slid off the register one after another. In 1977, what remained of British shipbuilding was nationalised, taken into public ownership in a last attempt to hold the industry together, and for a few years, the men of the Tyne fought for their yards with everything they had. The Save Our Shipyards campaign of 1983 and 1984 is still within living memory on Tyneside. The workers, the unions, and the local politicians made the case, in films and marches, and to anyone who would listen, that the Tyne yards were genuinely world-class, that the skills built up over generations could not be replaced once they were gone, and that it was an act of national madness to throw all of it away to save a few years of subsidy. They did not win. The argument had already been lost in rooms in London. The yards kept closing, and by the end of the 1980s, of all the great shipbuilding names that had once lined both banks of the Tyne for mile after mile, only Swan Hunter at Wallsend was left standing. And its future too was slipping through the region's fingers, kept alive on a dwindling trickle of warship orders, until, in the following years, it too fell silent, and the cranes that had built the Mauretania came down for scrap. A river that had built ships for 600 years stopped building them. And then the coal, which cut even deeper, because the coal was older than the ships, and reached into more villages. The miners' strike of 1984 and 1985 was, beneath everything else, a battle over one question: whether a government had the right to close working pits with coal still in them, because officials had judged them uneconomic, and whether the communities built entirely around those pits had any say at all in their own survival. It was the longest and most bitter industrial dispute in modern British history, and the mining communities of Northumberland and Durham were at the very centre of it. Families went a year without wages. Communities that had stood together for centuries were, in some places, split down the middle, and in the end, they lost. After they lost, the closures came like a tide going out and never coming back. The pits of the northeast shut one after another through the late 80s and into the 90s, each closure taking with it not just the miners' jobs, but the shops and the clubs and the whole economy that had grown up around the colliery. In December 1993, the Wearmouth Colliery in Sunderland closed, the last deep mine in the entire Durham coalfield, a coalfield that had employed 170,000 men within the memory of people still living. The site where it stood is now covered by Sunderland's football stadium, and they called it, with a kind of defiant grief, the Stadium of Light, after the lamps the miners carried underground. And then, on the 26th of January 2005, at Ellington Colliery on the Northumberland coast, the very last deep coal mine in the whole of the northeast of England was closed. Ellington had opened in 1909. At the time of the 1984 strike, it had employed over 2,000 men. The manager reportedly announced the end in 5 flat words: "Gentlemen, the pit is closed." Centuries of history ended in a single sentence, on an ordinary winter morning, with a few hundred men standing in the cold. Across the coalfields of Britain as a whole, something like 170,000 mining jobs were lost between 1984 and 1997, and in the areas that depended on them, that represented a full quarter of all the work available to men. The pit villages did not simply lose their pits. They lost the one thing they had been built to do, the thing that had given them their wages, their routine, their identity, and above all their pride, and for the most part, nothing was ever put in its place. The winding gear was cut down, the banners went into museums and church halls. The men who had defined themselves by a dangerous, skilled collective trade found themselves in their 40s and 50s with nothing, in towns that suddenly had no reason to exist, and a way of life that had lasted, in this corner of England, since the Middle Ages, simply stopped. So what is the verdict on Newcastle? It would be dishonest to give you only one side, because there genuinely are two, and they are still argued over fiercely in the region today. For the closures, the case is not nothing. Deep coal mining is brutal, dangerous work that killed and maimed men by the thousand, and the northeast coalfield is written through with disasters: 204 killed at New Hartley in 1862, 85 at Easington in 1951, and hundreds more across the centuries. British coal and British ships had genuinely become expensive, undercut by cheaper producers abroad, and propping them up with public money forever was, its defenders argued, simply postponing the inevitable at enormous cost. The world had changed its fuel and its shipyards, and no city, however proud, can freeze the world in place. Against the closures, the case is heavier, and to most people in the northeast, it is overwhelming, and it is not really about economics at all. It is about how it was done. This was not, they will tell you, a gentle managed decline, with something better waiting on the other side. There was no serious plan to replace what was destroyed. It was a demolition, carried out at a pace and with a coldness that felt, to the people living through it, like punishment, by a government that seemed to regard the coalfields not as communities in need of help through a hard transition, but as a political enemy to be broken. The coal was still in the ground. The alternative jobs were not coming. Whole towns were stripped of the single reason they existed, and then left, for decades, with mass unemployment, ill health, addiction, and a grief that settled into the buildings and never quite lifted. Studies of the former pit villages a generation later found communities still marked by it, the loss of work in a proud physical trade rippling down through the health and the spirit of the people who were left. And there is a bitterness in the specific geography of it that the region has never swallowed. The wealth these coalfields and these yards had generated for centuries had flowed, overwhelmingly, south, to London and the institutions of the state. When the industries that produced that wealth were no longer convenient, the same South decided their fate and then moved on. The city that had powered the empire, that had given Britain the railway and the turbine and the electric light, and armed its navy, that had asked for nothing but the right to keep working, was told in effect that its work was finished and its future was somebody else's problem. It was not beaten by the world, they will say. It was switched off by a decision made hundreds of miles away, by people who would never once have to live in the dark they left behind. And yet, this is not quite where it ends, because the Northeast has never been willing to disappear quietly, and the pride that built the ships did not die with them. The Tyne is still there, of course, running down to the sea exactly as it always did, the river that carried the coal that lit the world. It is spanned now by 7 bridges through the heart of the city, and the great tilting Millennium Bridge downstream, and along its banks where the yards once stood, there are now concert halls and galleries and glass offices, a quayside remade for a different age. The last working shipyard is gone, but the Tyne still builds and services the huge structures of the North Sea energy industry, the platforms and the turbines of a newer kind of power, and something of the old skill survives in those new forms. And on the Gateshead bank, above the site of old collieries and cokeworks, stands the Angel of the North, a vast rust-coloured steel figure 200 tons in weight, with the wingspan of a jumbo jet, made from steel, of the kind the region once forged, standing with its wings held out over the traffic on the road south. When people asked its sculptor why an angel, here, of all places, he pointed to the ground it stands on, and to the men who had worked in the dark under that hillside for 200 years, and said it was a place to remember them, and to mark the passage from an age of coal and heavy industry to whatever comes next. It has become, almost against the odds, the best-loved piece of public art in Britain, and it stands guard over a landscape that most of the country only ever thinks of as somewhere it drives past. And once a year, in July, the city of Durham fills with tens of thousands of people, and the banners come out. The Durham Miners' Gala, the big meeting, was a dying event in the 1970s as the pits closed, and by rights it should have faded away entirely when the last mine shut. Instead, it has grown, decade on decade, until it now draws its biggest crowds in generations. The lodges parade their banners through the streets to the river, behind the brass bands, exactly as they did when there were still pits to march for. The mines have gone, the men who dug them are going, but their grandchildren carry the banners anyway, because some things are harder to bulldoze than a colliery. Stand on the Tyne now, on a winter evening, and look at the water. The bridges are lit gold above it. The old staiths stand black and empty over the river, where the colliers used to load, where for 700 years the coal of a nation went down to the sea. The city that fueled an empire is quieter now, and poorer, and it is still working out what it is for, in a world that decided it did not need what it made. But the river is still there, and the pride is still there, and the men who kept the fires of the world burning are not quite forgotten. Not while there is a single banner left to carry through the streets of Durham on a summer morning. If you have walked with this story all the way to the end, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We uncover a different lost British town or city every week, and there are far more of them than you would ever think. The next one is waiting for you on screen right now.